Hello, everyone. I'm Hans Engel from the Directors Guild of Canada. Welcome to our third episode of DGC Masterclass via Zoom, bringing you together with some of the most interesting creatives in the industry today. The DGC prides itself on being the place where the creative community of the industry comes together to celebrate and discuss the work. The current global crisis has thrust us all online like never before. Trying to see this as an opportunity, we are reaching out to creatives we might have previously not been able to bring you. We're going behind the scenes and talking to some of the top creatives in the industry, covering directors, designers, picture and sound editors, with a new episode every Thursday. You'll receive a new invitation every week with a specific link to tune in. We kicked off the series 2 weeks ago with a fantastic session with the great Emmy-winning and Oscar-nominated director Jean-Marc Vallée, moderated by DGC President Tim Southam. Last week, we hosted the fantastic Emmy-winning picture editor of Breaking Bad, Kelly Dixon, moderated by renowned DGC picture editor Paul Day. And tonight, I'm thrilled to be welcoming Academy Award-winning design team, David and Sandy Wasco.
Well,
David, and a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
David,
We're honored to be here.
David and Sandy are husband and wife duo who have worked together on more than 20 films in the past 25 years. They've collaborated with some of the most talented filmmakers today, including Quentin Tarantino, Wes Anderson, Michael Mann, and recently Damien Chazelle and Aaron Sorkin. David and Sandy won the 2016 Academy Award for Best Achievement in Production Design, the Art Directors Guild Award for Excellence in Production Design, and a BAFTA nomination for Best Production Design for their work on La La Land. After working with Tarantino on Reservoir Dogs in '92, they continued working with him designing Pulp Fiction, Jackie Brown, Kill Bill 1 and 2, and Inglourious Basterds, which received a BAFTA nomination for Best Production Design. Wasco's design work on Wes Anderson's The Royal Tenenbaums was featured in the Smithsonian's National Design Triennial in 2003. And I'm just thrilled that I could read all that about you guys. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Mouthful.
Thank you.
Our moderator tonight is the fantastic Arv Greywal. Arv is a production designer who's been in the film industry for over 20 years. Arv has designed projects for renowned directors such as Cronenberg, George Romero, Deepa Mehta, Richard Donner, and Mary Harron. He's worked on eclectic films such as Lars and the Real Girl, one of my favorites, Jennifer's Body, Resident Evil, Afterlife in 3D, No Escape, Brandon Cronenberg's Antiviral, and the war movie Haina Road by Paul Fox. He's worked on Waco for the Paramount Channel, Genius Picasso for Fox Television and National Geographic, and Alias Grace for CBC Netflix. He's also designed pilot episodes of the television series such as 7 and NBC's Timeless, among others. Arv has been nominated in the production designer category for 2 Genie Awards, 5 DGC Awards, and 2 Canadian Screen Awards. And in 2003, he won a DGC Team Award for Cronenberg's Spider. More recently, in 2018, he won a Canadian Screen Award for Achievement in Production Design for Sarah Polley's Alias Grace. Absolutely amazing. Before I turn it over to these guys, feel free to send in questions throughout the masterclass by using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Arv will try to get to as many questions as possible, but may not be able to ask all of them. And with that, over to you, Arv, David, and Sandy.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks, Hans. First of all, it's such a pleasure to talk to David and Sandy. You are heroes, basically, for any production designer. And I think anyone who actually wants to learn production design should just start with one of your movies. Start with El Norte, which I think is one of the most remarkable movies that I've seen, and come all the way up to Molly's Game in that order, and the order of being shot and filmed. And I think you'll learn more about production design than anyone else can sort of speak to you about it. So that, I think, is it's an honor to speak to the both of you. One thing I want to do is note for the audience that I'm really happy to take any questions and intersperse them throughout our talk. What I'm hoping to do is basically go from sort of script to screen so that we can give an idea of how David and Sandy and what their methodology and how they work, essentially. And I'm hoping that as the questions pop up, and if they're pertinent to our question as we're asking them, then I'd like to just put that in. one of the things that I saw last week was there were something like 43 unanswered questions, and I'd rather not have that. I mean, this is all really for the benefit of people watching. So with having said that, let's start with kind of your origin stories. So if I may, David, and we'll bring you into it, Sandy, in a second. You started out by doing, as I mentioned, El Norte, again, a fantastic movie. Everybody's got to watch that one. It's more pertinent now than it was in 1984 when it was made, I believe, in a certain way. But you started out doing very small movies in various positions, sort of, you know, 1 or 2 person art departments, I'm sure you were part of. And then you kind of just jumped right launched yourself into production design. I get this question a lot from budding production designers. How do I go about becoming a production designer? Your method is unusual, just to kind of start doing it right away. Is that something you still recommend? What were your kind of ideas about it then, and how do you feel about it now?
So, first of all, I'd like to just say that our comments are basically talking about what we did, and they're not necessarily the best way to go about doing things. There are certainly really good schools that we've actually talked at. We have here in Los Angeles American Film Institute. We have Chapman College. There's a great school in Montreal. And if you want to go to film school, that's a great way to go. We did not do that. Our experience is sort of just working in the field doing this. And I actually kind of came into the game in my mid-20s. I had moved to Los Angeles with actually the promise to interview with my favorite production designer, Dean Tavaleris. And I moved here in 1981. Excuse me if I go on a little bit long, but I would like to explain a little bit about my background, and that might help in answering this question. But I did move here in 1981 with the promise of an interview with Mr. Tavaleris. And I wanted to sort of break into working for Zoetrope Studios, which is Francis Ford Coppola's iconic studio. Some of my favorite movies. But it was 1981, and Zoetrope was coming out with One from the Heart, a wonderful movie, and it tanked at the box office. It just didn't do well, and they started to flounder and started to go bankrupt. So 2 things happened. My interview went away. I ended up in Los Angeles without a job, and things didn't quite work out the way I had planned. But a friend, and this was what I wanted to bring up as a really important thing, and that's to start making connections and meeting people. A friend said, David, you're without an interview, you're without a job. A friend that is starting up a feature film is looking for an assistant. So would you want to interview? And I said, of course. So I went in, and even though I don't have any movie experience, he hired me. This was also odd timing in that it was during a big director and writer strike, 1981. So there was no work happening in Hollywood. And I think that the movie that I got hired on was called The Beastmaster. It was kind of like a Conan the Barbarian, Bronze Age period fantasy. Was the only game in town. It had, everybody was working on it. I got to meet everybody. It was shot by the great John Alcott, Stanley Kubrick cinematographer, fresh off of The Shining and Barry Lyndon. I got to talk with him. He was friendly with me and very nice. So I ended up working, even though I was hired as the production designer's assistant, I was sort of like an assistant art director and an art department coordinator. I did both of those things. So I tracked the monies. I interfaced with all of these set construction companies that we had an in-house construction company. We were employing Hollywood has a bunch of non-union set construction companies that we were farming out to. So I met everybody. It was great. So I was almost employed throughout for almost a year. It was many months, and I got the bug and I loved it. It was wonderful, and I ended up finishing that movie, which actually did pretty well at the box office. And through my connections on that movie, one of the set construction companies from Burbank invited me. They said, David, we need an in-house art director. Come on and work with us. And we're going to let you go and interview for other movies if you want to interview. And it was a perfect scenario. So I went to work for Design Setters in Burbank. And we were doing some big sets for movies like Space Hunter. These were other big, the Star Trek movies. And I ended up adding to my collection of people that I would call connections. I met Leon Erickson, who designed McCabe and Mrs. Pardon?
Sorry, we can hear somebody, Hans, if that's you.
So in any event, I met a bunch of great art directors that came in that that I was able to watch while they were doing commercials. We were
obviously
doing commercials with them. So one of the so I ended up taking. In one of my interviews, I ended up taking a small movie that was kind of like a Disney children's movie, where I was sort of the whole art department. So I figured, why not take the production design credit or the art director credit, because I was the only one doing everything. So I kind of just kept that. That's sort of how I broke in at the high mark. Now that person that hired me on that ended up doing 2 sequels, which I also did, but he also ended up, Trevor Black, he ended up getting the production manager job on a movie called El Norte. And he said, David, my friends that are doing this movie, Gregory Nava and Anna Thomas, need somebody to help them with the sets for this movie. Would I be interested in meeting them? Which I did. And they hired me to oversee the sets that were being readied in Los Angeles while they were grabbing footage in Chiapas, which is Chiapas for Guatemala. And it is a story about a brother and sister leaving Guatemala and traveling through Mexico and coming to the promised land, coming to America. So I kind of piecemeal worked on sets that they would then come to after they did their filming in Mexico. While in Mexico, they had a couple of near catastrophes happen where they were robbed. They had the film, it was shot on 35mm film. All the negative stock was confiscated. DP was held hostage. So basically, long story short, they ended up getting coming back to America and not being able to complete their footage that was being established in southern Mexico. So they said, well, David, would you be able to help us by replicating this town that we established? Which I recruited friends from the Beastmaster, and we built this town, which is still existing in one of the motion picture ranches in Hollywood. So this movie then was 87 non-consecutive days of shooting. There was nobody else in the art department. I basically did everything, and including building this complicated border crossing set that was a out of use sewer tunnel that had to have hordes of rats go over the actors. So I built this set out in an animal trainer's house. And when the film, evidently the film struck so many people that when Spielberg saw the movie, he reached out to the director and he said, how did you do that? And evidently then he took that idea and used it in Indiana Jones. There's a similar scene in Indiana Jones. So that movie then comes out and it becomes a pretty big hit. It struck a note with a lot of people. It won the Grand Award at the Montreal Film Festival in 1984. It was nominated for Best Screenplay Oscar. And I thought, you know, my gosh, this was sort of my first film. I'm going to keep this going. So then that started this cycle of doing about one movie a year, interviewing, which sometimes would take some time, getting the job, doing the movie, and then interviewing again. So that sort of cycle happened. At which point, now Sandy did not work with me on El Norte, but I started to realize that I was relying a lot on talking with her about what I was doing. And I thought, well, let's sort of start to work on these things together. And as scripts come in, because in the mid 1980s, I did acquire an agent, and it was through another friend. I went with the Gersh agency. And so scripts would come to me via the agent, and we would both read them. But
ultimately though, just to start
Yeah.
what you're saying, is it was this accruing of all kinds of contacts and other people to always call in between jobs and continue to look for jobs. Also, as with everybody, you can see how there's a little bit of luck in there.
Luck and timing.
Luck and timing. And whether you're working as the one-man band that you did on El Norte and previous to that, the great thing about that is you have every hat on your head at one point or another. So you learn a little bit about painting, a little bit about carpentry, and a little bit about dyeing, and a little bit of all those crafts that eventually you're going to oversee. Now, if you're going to go in as the small fish, the assistant or the PA, sort of the way you did on the Conan, what's the Beastmaster, then you're learning a lot from master craftsmen. So in a way, either route is a really good route. And you just have to keep, if you do have the bug and you just really want to do it, you're going to find your way.
Well,
can I add?
I'm sorry.
Can I just jump in, Sandy? I want to know in a certain way, and I think that's a really great explanation, sort of how you both started. But in terms of just the spark that got you into the film business, the both of you, I think you knew each other before you moved to LA. And did you know each other in art school or something like that? How did that all come about? What made you want to go to LA to sort of start doing film, essentially? What was that spark?
We met each other. I was just out of college. David was working as a display manager. You can tell them what it is. When we were working in Cambridge, Massachusetts. David had the bug to do film a long time ago, so I'll let you.
Yeah,
before I did.
I was lucky to be brought up in Vermont with two very creative parents that they're both artists. My dad was a Renaissance man. He's a great abstract expressionist, and we worked on. He was also a fantastic photographer. He was trained with Bernice Abbott at the Cooper Union in New York, and he worked as Arnold Newman's assistant right after the Second World War. So he's a brilliant photographer, and we did just ad hoc Super 8 movies and regular 8 movies, which I then started to do at high school. So I had that early bug, but I moved to California pretty early in the mid 70s, and I ended up at this company in my early 20s. that was sort of the first lifestyles company. It was sort of like Design Within Reach. And I became the corporate display director. So even though I was pretty young, I had a corporate job and they moved me around the country. When I was in San Francisco, I was working with one of the people there was the nanny to Francis Ford Coppola. So I would actually go over and hang out at Coppola's house in San Francisco. I had nothing to do with movies, but I remember meeting Sophia when she was a child. She was like 9 years old, and the two sons, they're both alive at the time, were young. But my friend Mary's boyfriend, who was working with me, said, David Francis is recruiting gophers, that's what he called them. He said, gophers to go to the Philippines to work on Heart of Darkness. And do I want to? So they gave me this script, and I read the script, and I thought, this is interesting. Go to the Philippines. They said, well, you know, you're going to have to get a whole series of shots, and we're going to have to go next week. And you know, this was Apocalypse Now. So at that same time, I was offered to, within this company, I was offered a higher position, and they wanted me to move to Cambridge, Mass. And I thought, you know what? I don't want to get all these shots to go to the Philippines. I don't think I want to do this. I'm going to stick with this. So I really resented, I gave up to be a PA on Apocalypse Now. And that's the reason why I moved back, because it became the best movie, my favorite movie.
So you had to get back.
And my friend Jerry, who went, they actually gave him a speaking part. He was Johnny from Malibu in this very famous surfing scene he has a line in the movie. So I keep in touch with my friend Jerry, and so in any event, that's why I had that early interest in working on film, and I gave up this opportunity to work. And that's why I wanted to go back and meet Dean Tavaleros, who designed Apocalypse Now, along with The Godfather. And
I think we were both, it's like, you can tell, we're both really visual people, and David's background through design and photography and theater arts and things like that. Mine were similar, but it was through college. So I majored in art history, but history too. So there was all that background from that. And I did fine arts and photography and theater.
And all of that applies to.
I think it was really lucky, another lucky thing, that we found film. You know, David found it. I followed him to Los Angeles later.
Well,
their film was the perfect job that we could all put all these background pieces together and put them to good use.
And at least at that time, you didn't need a formal film education. We kind of went at it in an informal way. Now, had I not stuck with that company, had I not turned down that PA position, I would have not met Sandy. This company moved me to Boston, and that's where Sandy was working at that same place. That's where I met Sandy. So that was a timing thing. It was a decision thing. I would have gone to work on Apocalypse Now. That was a very, very difficult shoot. That actually, all the sets were destroyed in a hurricane. There were a lot of problems.
Right. Can I jump ahead a few years? So you and Sandy started working together, and after a few years of work where you were a factotum, basically doing every job on every small movie that you got this little $1.2 million movie called Reservoir Dogs. And not just Reservoir Dogs, but within the span of about 4 years, you had Reservoir Dogs, Killing Zoe, Pulp Fiction, Oleana, and Bottle Rocket. So you were working with Tarantino, Roger Avery, David Mamet, and Wes Anderson. How did that happen?
Well, we kept the cycle going where we would work on a movie, we would interview, we would get scripts.
So the script came through your agents, David?
scripts came through the agent, or they,
Reservoir Dogs
or
came
they,
through a connection.
there was a connection with Reservoir Dogs. One of the line producers, Paul Hellerman, I ended up helping. He was doing something at American Film Institute, and he asked me to come in to help. We just ended up meeting him. So he was the UPM on Reservoir Dogs, and I think he might have been instrumental in, you know, when directors and producers are meeting designers, they'll meet 3 or 4. And I was one of 3 or 4 people that they met. And I did not know Quentin. But the script comes, I think Sandy read it first, and we were just blown away by the script. It wasn't a big art department movie, meaning it wasn't this big visual extravaganza, but it was so interesting in that it touched on humor, it was violent, it was funny, it was like a play in that it was in. So we really liked it, and we thought, you know, we need to go after this. So I met Quentin, and at Lawrence Bender's apartment in Hollywood. Nobody knew who he was at the time. Nobody knew who Lawrence Bender was. And Quentin said to me he liked, because I had a string of these period movies that I did in the 80s that were for American Playhouse, and they were kind of our bread and butter. They were with quality scripts. They were usually the director was the same person as the writer, and they would run theatrical, and then they would get a little time slot on PBS. We did a few of them that were, they would move us around the country. We did them in Montana and around. We did a few period ones that Quentin liked, and I think that's what he said, that he liked my work. I had a portfolio, and it was a joy to work on.
I think that getting Reservoir Dogs and the success of Reservoir Dogs and the success of it really as a script and a written piece, in a way I can see that that's where Wes and Mamet were attracted, because this was another writer-director, and they were all doing sort of not a small budget as Reservoir Dogs, but smallish, controlled. Mamet does sort of a proscenium type arrangement with his designs and his films, as well as Reservoir Dogs certainly seemed like a theater production. Yes. And Wes is very theatrical. So I think those steps.
Mm-hmm. Well, Wes and Owen Wilson were guests on the set for Pulp Fiction. And I don't think they knew Quentin. They somehow just got invited on the set, and Quentin talked with them. And Quentin said, David, will you take these guys around and just show them? We were building Jackrabbit Slim's set, and I gave them a tour. And when they were leaving, they said, Wes said, David, we have a script. Would it be okay if we send this to you? And I said, sure, of course. And it was Bottle Rocket. And we ended up doing Bottle Rocket. So that was the connection with Bottle Rocket. The other thing that was interesting with Bottle Rocket is that we end up working with another mentor, favorite production designer, Polly Platt, who was hired as a producer. She had nothing to do with the art direction, but she was one of our favorite production designers. She did The Last Picture Show. She did, she's a wonderful production. Paper Moon. Yeah. She's, really good. She was married to Peter Bogdanovich early on. So that was an interesting thing. So, but
can I ask you about these interviews? Because we're getting some questions, and I've always sort of heard this from people who are really trying to break into production design. Within that interview, and I will come back to this question a little later on, but within that interview with Quentin, for example, what did you bring? You had your portfolio of previous works, but what was that kind of hook, or do you have something like that? Do you have sort of 10 points that you think up during the interview to say, I've got to talk about this, or this? Do you challenge the director? Do you kind of bring a piece that you think this is what his film's all about or her film's all about? What is your hook within an interview?
It evolved. to that, and it evolved to now putting together sort of a more formal lookbook to help sell our ideas to a director. At that early point, I brought up a hard portfolio. And again, this is pre-internet, pre-computers, 1992, I guess. And so I actually realized that I enjoyed interviewing. I liked meeting the directors, and a lot of people are very nervous about that, and I was really pretty relaxed. And it was an opportunity to kind of feel that person out also and see if so not only are they interviewing me to see if I'm somebody that they would like to work with, I'm interviewing them, or I'm seeing if this is somebody I'd like to work with. And when it's mutual, and it all works out, and sometimes they get the job. But I also am because I'm still am Luddite and very much analog. I believe in a hard copy paper resume, and I think that that's really important. And I have a huge collection of resumes that have been sent to me from day one. And I think that it's important that you have a well-designed resume that I felt that I did. And I always tried to keep it on one page, even though sometimes the information that comes to me from other folks, other people that are interviewing with me, I'll get 5 pages of a resume. And so the tips at that point for me was just an interesting book that had pictures of the sets that I did and a resume, and that's all I did. And I
think it's taught with that one. I think it was a lot of talking about the script and locations, because that was primary. And I think, in fact, he even changed the idea of it became that sort of mortuary set, that warehouse. And I think originally it wasn't written for that. It was written as something else, correct?
Well,
so it was working out where he wanted to shoot it between the two of them, the neighborhoods and
well, the initial meeting where I got the job, and I like to not know, even though my agent could maybe tell me who I'm interviewing with against. I like to not know who I'm competing with, and my interviews have evolved to be approximately 1 hour long. That's sort of a normal interview. But this one was quite short. And it's interesting because the one from Molly's Game was also very short with Aaron Sorkin. But getting back to Reservoir Dogs, Quentin wasn't the original director. He wrote the screenplay. And Monty Hellman, who was the producer on Reservoir Dogs, was the original director. Monty has done some amazing offbeat movies like Two Lane Blacktop, which was supposed to be the next Easy Rider. And I guess when Harvey Keitel got on board, hired, it became a bigger movie, even though it was a very small movie. And Quentin decided he wanted to direct it himself, or I don't know whether, because I believe it was Miramax also at the time. It was Harvey Weinstein.
I believe it was, yeah.
Yeah, so it was a very friendly decision that Monty would sort of step back, remain producer, because Monty was around. Monty was the one that actually brought on Andrei Sekula, the DP. But so it was very friendly, and we're also scouting with a different DP, a Spanish fellow, Josep Savit. He was the DP that has worked with Monty before. As a matter of fact, he did Monty's a really great movie that Monty directed recently. But Josep had just finished 3 movies in a row and was sort of burnt out, and we were scouting and he was tired. He just didn't want to do this. So Andre is brought in, and I would have to attribute the look, or part of the success of the look, and this is somebody that you've worked with. Mm-hmm. Part of the success of the look was his cinematography. And I also have to say that some of the other things that we've worked on the
Kill Bill.
success of the look is with working with a master cinematographer. And we've worked with some of the best. And Andre really gave an interesting look to this with a super high-speed film that was new. It was shot on film with lots of big bright lights. In any event, off of interviewing, but it was a short interview with Quentin, and
Sure.
but we were relaxed with each other.
Nice. Can I ask one of the very pertinent audience questions that's come in? Andrew asks, you work with a lot of auteur directors. What's your approach to working with these directors who are so different and so specific in their approaches? So I guess the question is sort of asking, do you change to kind of work with each director in a certain way?
Absolutely. I think every single movie is completely different, and every story is completely different. I think the only thing that maybe remains sort of the same is maybe a core team of a few key people that I like to have, because it is a, you know, it's not me doing this. It's not just me and Sandy. It's a group of people. And I really struggle to get a talented group of support group that is helping pull this off. I think it's the biggest collaborative art form of our time. I don't think that there's anything. I mean, I would liken what we do to an architecture firm that's building a skyscraper where you have thousands of people.
Mm-hmm.
You almost have, there's a lot of people that contribute.
But before you started building skyscrapers, you were doing little houses, let's say, these small movies. Now, you jumped from, and I'm going to just connect a bunch of movies. You jumped from Reservoir Dogs to Pulp Fiction. You jumped from Bottle Rocket to the Royal Tenenbaums. I mean, these are massive leaps. I mean, Rushmore was in there. What happened is these directors who are making very tiny $1 million movies or less, maybe even in terms of Bottle Rocket, making these really tiny movies, and all of a sudden they take you as the production designer to their very large movies. So, you know, how far away is Royal Tenenbaums from Bottle Rocket, and how far away is Pulp Fiction from Reservoir Dogs? And you're kind of the common thread in all that. And I don't need to be immodest here. These massive leaps, were they, you know, were you part of that leap in a certain way? It's like, I can make this larger, I can make this bigger for you.
Well, I think we kind of, you develop a rapport with the director, and basically we're helping them carry out their vision. And if we can do it in kind of a painless way where we're not in their face all the time and bugging them, doing it in kind of a background way, which that's how I like to work. They appreciate that. And I think that that's a good thing. Or the other thing that I like to do is to take their good ideas, and all the directors have ideas. Some have really good ideas, like Wes Anderson, and really good art direction ideas. And I'm completely open to working as the guy that's carrying out these ideas. And I think that that's totally fine. I mean, we are doing this for the director, and we are doing the director's vision. So
Quentin was oddly really smart, because in starting with something like Reservoir Dogs, and I think he knew it, the scripts just became more complicated. And he had seen some of his scripts done by other directors.
Yeah, Tony Scott.
Yeah, before. So he knew about big filmmaking. So he knew how to take those steps. And for us, as the money grew from $5,000 to, you know, 50 million, it was really just the toolbox getting bigger, because the stories were similar, and the intent of the director, just because we'd known them over a few projects, we kind of understood what they wanted.
Well, there was a trust.
Which was really great.
Yeah, there was a trust that happened with all of these directors. And we're just really greatly honored that some of these people called us back so many times, and the most was with Quentin, because we did 6 of his 9 movies to date.
Amazing.
And David Mamet also was very, very kind to have us work with him a lot. Wes, to do his first 3 movies, it was a great honor.
One drawback to coming up from the bottom or freshman efforts with directors is they were all sort of analog, because they hadn't, they were doing their own thing, and they hadn't really grasped or wanted to go in a direction that involved big effects and things like that. So for us, that was our path too. So that's sort of one area where we have a little bit of a
right. So it must have sort of been more striking for you in a way. I'm not taking anything away from the production designer, but it must have been more striking for you to kind of go from smaller movies, the couple of mentioned, to the larger things, just because the burden is so much bigger. The ideas are all there. The production designer is coming up with all of this stuff, but the physical manifestation of the set now drops on you in a big way. How did you handle some of that?
I got lucky in a way that I did Pacific Heights as a buyer. Mm-hmm. And then I did...
That's John Schlesinger.
Schlesinger movie. And then I did The Hand That Rocks the Cradle
as the key decorator before
Reservoir Dogs.
Curtis Hanson.
So in a way, I was lucky enough. It's really important to have really good teachers. And these 2 production designers that were involved with us, and the decorators on Pacific Heights, which was Clay Griffiths and Deborah Shute, you just listened and you learned so much. Mm-hmm. And it was really good. And being a buyer, and then later I was on set a lot. So I learned a lot about what the DP needs, how quickly the group needs to move, how to support the actors and those kinds of things. So there were all these small little things I was learning on the way that helped with something like Reservoir Dogs, which I knew with that budget, it really just had to be color and texture. And then as the things grew, they were sort of step by step, in that
they were still very much the same movie. I think even
Royal Tenenbaums,
Pulp Fiction was basically a bigger Reservoir Dogs. It was still contained. We're still in Los Angeles.
I think they were so exciting that you got so involved.
The big jump would be, say, to go to Kill Bill, which was an international movie.
Right.
It was filmed all around the world. And same with Inglourious Bastards was a bigger movie. Even though we were based out of Berlin, we were in Paris. And
before we kind of get into the details of those, we'll get to them. Let me throw in another audience question. People are asking, a couple of people are asking, in fact, just in terms of crafting and creating the look for the film. So, you've kind of come along with the smaller films, and in terms of those, you're giving, and I'm sort of speaking on your behalf, which I shouldn't. Tell me how you crafted and created sort of Pulp Fiction. If you were on Reservoir Dogs and basically servicing the script to a degree, giving it the look as best you can, even Killing Zoe, where it was mostly paint in a certain way that sort of pulled some of that movie together. How do you go from that to all of a sudden designing Jackrabbit Slims, for example? What was your kind of approach to that?
Quentin's request was he wanted us to be frugal, and he even ended up asking us that same request on Inglourious Bastards. He wanted us to be very modest and frugal, even though it was a much bigger thing. But he said he wanted to kind of save our budget for Jackrabbit Slims. He wanted that to be the big splashy thing, kind of in the early part of the movie. So we took those marching orders, and we actually approached it very architecturally. We did a white model, which is the way that you work off.
Yes.
And we were able to show that to Quentin. And we kind of worked backwards from the shape of a big warehouse that was connected to our production office, and that became the shape of the large club. So we kind of injected a lot. One of the things that we also offshoot while we were working early on in the early 90s, we did a architectural exhibit at Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles called Case Study House Exhibit, which was an unknown thing, and we ended up in that world. So we took that sort of mid-century look and injected that into the look of Jack Rabbit's limbs.
Well, Quentin again was a wordsmith and the story. And all his films, now that we get to know them better, we didn't really so much at this time, they seem to be series of chapters, and they're all really wonderful. Some of them, you know, don't go somewhere till later, but there's a series of chapters. So he is in the script. He doesn't describe the locations or the sets very much. Relating to Jack Rabbits, he did a little, and he did show us films that we were to look at that he liked, Elvis Presley movies and some things to research for that. But with the other thing, I think what we did was we took the title Pulp Fiction. We took the idea of the series of stories, and then in the breakdown, which just listed, you know, Hawthorne Grill, Joe Plus Apartment, down the line, we broke it down into styles. So there's sort of 50 styles, all related to sort of pulp noir look of the 30s and 40s. So there is references, well, there's the 50s things, and there's the 40s things that seep into the boxing world a little. And there's the 70s, 80s things that are sort of police and more present day, well-to-do things with the, what was Ving Rhames' character. So that variety of styles kind of fit in that way. And then the color palette was related too. We just didn't want, you know, a bunch of greens running together. We wanted each chapter to be sort of a variety.
Quentin's way of describing what he wants is he would say, look at this movie and look at that movie. And that's sort of what I want. And he said there was a Howard Hawks movie called Red Line 7000. That was a race car driver movie. And then there was Elvis Presley's Speedway, which was a B movie that also had to do with race car drivers. So that's what he wanted, this kind of race car driver theme. And in Red Line 7000, there's a club that people are playing with slot car track, racing cars, little cars. So we just lifted those things from that. In Elvis Presley's movie, they go to a diner and they're sitting in these cars that are cut in half, and those are the dining banquettes. So we just grabbed all those ideas, and because there's a dance number, we said, let's do this raised tachometer in the middle of the dance floor that then would be surrounded by these kind of cool cars, and then you're dining in these cars. So that's how it kind of all came together as far as the look.
And for Quentin's movies, he really is involved with the writer, with the actors, and the movement of his directions, the actors blocking through the sets.
That's the most important thing.
Something like West, we were getting a lot more specific information about the look throughout.
Yeah.
Cool. Can I jump into a couple of audience questions? I'm going to lump a couple together because we're getting quite a few coming in. And I think this one's from a director. Basically, what they like to sort of understand, if I could put these two together, is sort of the best advice you could give to a director about how to envision the production design for their own sort of movie, but also what mistakes directors make when thinking of production design and when kind of talking to production designers in a way. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think there's any mistake a director can make I don't think they can make it. The only mistakes we've ever heard of are with directors that they're getting pressure from something else. There's something else happening in the day.
Well, if you hire somebody, if you hire a production designer, it's just like if I'm hiring an art director, you don't want to micromanage them. If the director is going to hire a production designer, you kind of just want to let them do their thing. Now it's our job as a production designer, art department, to not give one thing to the director. You give. Okay, we can do Jackrabbit Slims 3 different ways. You can do it kind of wild, or you can do it low key, or you know. So the job of the art director, the production designer, is to really make the director happy. We're doing the director. If the director is unhappy with the director, if all the director does is give the little bullet paragraph of a description, which that's all Quentin knew. It was a little paragraph that said, okay, this is kind of a lost in time nightclub, and then his reference to the 2 movies. It's a back and forth thing.
I think it's really important, you know, that well, you never want the director to be surprised. So you really have to keep that communication going early on. And there has to be time. Sometimes it gets lost nowadays because all of a sudden you're interviewed when the thing's already greenlit with a date.
Well,
so it's really important just to have that time to sit down with the director and make sure that you understand their vision, and make sure there's always communication, so that you're not, you know, arriving with something they've never pictured.
Well, that's where a model comes in, a white model. That's where concept illustration comes in, where we now have some wonderful craftspeople that can do really great concept illustrations, where they can take a keyframe and you blow that up and it's in color, and you can sometimes put in the actors and you say, this is what it will look like. So you can show them before any monies are spent. And that's sort of, now it's also interesting how many directors actually can't comprehend from a concept sketch or from a model, where they might say, gosh, this is exactly what I'm looking for. And then it's built, and they'll stand in and say, what is this? I didn't know whether it was going to be like this.
That comes down to communication.
So some directors can't see these things, but if you have an art director or a production designer that you rely on and have faith in, and like Sandy said, is not going to surprise you, you chip away at it, and you do models and you do concept sketches. But
there's all kinds.
Yeah.
So can I ask for a second, just to kind of answer the question by the director who's writing her script, I believe, right now. They're asking, what should they know about production design in a certain way as they're writing it? Should they pay any heed to it? And my answer would be no, right? The biggest movie you can. But what are your thoughts on something like that?
Boy, that's a tough thing.
That again depends on what their intent is. Some people really want the look of it to be important. Say something now, Hitchcock does them both. You'll do, you know, both sides. Be specific about.
Right. Well, you guys, when you.
But Wes Anderson also wants to go big, and
but
he'll
you're
write
right.
something
You don't
big.
have to put anything in, because really it's the mood will be conveyed through the script.
Right.
And it's something you can sit down and talk about.
But
right.
why limit the writer-director to pigeonhole them into something that is limiting to, well, gosh, I shouldn't write this because it's going to cost too much money. You should just be free and write their story, and just what,
That's right.
then because they're also doing the same thing that we're doing in getting a job. They're taking their project and pitching it to different studios to try to get it greenlit and happen. Let the producers say to them, you know, gosh, if we cut it down a little bit, then we'll greenlight this movie. So
that's another
it's our job to carry out whatever the story is, and I don't think the director should be limited.
Because I think in a certain way, we within the world of the film, we become the sort of cultural anthropologists, sort of digging into the film and what is this world and how we can create it. So yeah, my advice always is write your story,
Yeah.
And basically, as production designers and art directors and all those set decorators, will come out with something that you can do within, you know, within your budget, within the scope of your movie, etc. So I think, yeah, I love that. Can we talk a little bit about your relationship? Well, I want to jump back a little bit. I'm sorry. We've only gotten through question 3, so we're already an hour in. But I just want to jump back a little bit. You go into a design meeting with the director with a lookbook generally. And sometimes the director will have a lookbook. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that lookbook evolves and gets shared with other departments and what your preference is for that sort of thing?
Well, I think it's interesting because we talked a little bit, we hit a little bit on how the early interviews were, because again, you know, I'm referencing my beginning of my career, which was a while back. And now things have become a lot more advanced, where a lookbook or something to be brought to the interview to help sell yourself is very, very important. And often we end up spending a fair amount of time and money in putting together a lookbook. And I, again, I said that we're pretty analog. We do have a fairly big library that we refer to. And of course, the other kind of helpful person that I usually involve is a researcher, which is a non-union position and hired usually before the film is even greenlit. Often they're interviewing designers sometimes before our film is greenlit. But yes, we have to bring in a book. We put together a book that can be scrolled through on an iPad or on a computer, or I also like to have a hard copy book because it's a nice prop that that you can talk about the movie. Now, for instance, for La La Land, when I went in and interviewed on that movie, the director actually had his own lookbook that he put together, and I brought a lookbook that Sandy and I put together, and it was a coincidence that some of the same images were the same. Some of his images and some of my images, and we thought we were kind of on the same page, which was kind of a good thing. Now, Damien also put together, it was very interesting. He edited using different movies, and he actually used a bunch of movies that I've worked on, Sandy and I've worked on, where he made La La Land like it was a 3-minute short that this is what the movie should look like. But what he was doing is he was taking that around and pitching it to different studio execs because he had to do the same thing. At that point, a musical was like, you know, what do you want to make a musical? Nobody wants to see a musical. So he was having to sell the idea. So he showed that to me, and it was so a lookbook is an important tool. It's a nice thing to have.
Yeah.
Can we jump forward a little bit to sort of the triumvirate that is the production designer, DP, and the director? And we can talk a little bit about how that triumvirate works, but I don't think it's that anymore. And I wonder how you feel about it, because now we have the visual effects supervisor, the physical effects have taken in sort of have become a large part of a lot of movies, maybe not some of the movies that you do, but a large part, and certainly the costume designer and people like that. What are your thoughts on kind of how the art department basically disseminates ideas, let's say, and takes ideas from the DP and from the director and kind of pulls them together?
Well, it's a collaboration. I think visual effects has become a bigger thing and almost should be, their office should be next door to the art department now. And it's become a bigger thing. And actually there's some wonderful production designers that are coming from being visual effects artists. So now that said, a lot of the movies that we've worked on have been with directors that wanted to play down visual effects, including Damien on La La Land, including Wes Anderson, who liked to do analog effects and not so much big visual effects. Now they've morphed into bigger movies, and visual effects has still become a big thing, but our experience has not been that much with. On Collateral, there was a visual effects assist that helped meld some of the sets together. Inglourious Bastards, some of the sets that were had to have visual effects to help them work into the
It's
movie.
crucial though that they're working hand in hand with you. We watch things like 1917. That team has to be working right with the art department and the DP, of course, because that was a perfect example of how all those four people have to work really closely together.
The DP, the production designer and director and visual effects, it's a give and take thing where everybody's listening to everybody and ideas are coming from everybody. I think also when we're hired on, or when I'm hired on, nobody else is hired on. It's usually very early
that has
on.
To change, though. Everybody has to be on.
But I usually have the ear of the director early on. Sometimes there's a location person that we're working with. And so the art department maybe has a bigger voice early on, that as all these other departments come on, the opportunity to have a one-on-one with the director diminishes. But the art department is still an important voice throughout.
I think that's a concern of all of ours, is that as preps get shortened, that we have the time to do that important collaboration with DP and SFX.
Yeah, I'll also, okay.
Sandy, can I ask you a question? You guys brought up Collateral, and I've been having my one-man David and Sandy Wasco sort of film festival.
Oh, great.
But watching Collateral again, I've never seen that much lighting in a movie, and practical lighting. And I think it's rather amazing. And what we're seeing now in film is that cameras have become so sensitive that you need a lot less light than you used to. You're not lighting from the floor as much anymore. And I'm wondering how you guys feel about that in terms of sort of, Sandy, you've had to kind of up your game in terms of the lighting that you bring, because I'm sure a lot of DPs are asking you to bring practical lights, because most of them are starting to light with practical lights. Can you talk about that a little bit, and maybe use Collateral as an example for that?
Well, Collateral was a perfect example of the good and the bad. It was one of the first digital films.
It was the first.
And in just researching and preparing to work with Michael Mann, who we hadn't worked with before, I watched all his movies. And I could see how lighting, even in film to him, was extremely important, and it silhouetted characters, and it gave a certain space a certain look, and it lit the night in a certain way. So I knew he was going to want that anyway. And then when it became necessary to actually use the practicals to give him that light versus the DP's bounce lights or backlights or whatever, it was a challenge in that we just had to be ready with every type of lamp available, whether it was sodium outside or mercury outside or all kinds, all the different lights except for maybe halogen inside, so that we were always ready, and there always had to be extras, which they do anyway. But it wasn't just the original business of a fixture, a perfect lampshade, perfect fabric treatments for light to come through. This involved, with the automobiles especially going down streets, it involved blocks. Streetlights and blocks of neon. Yeah. And
we had two trucks that would travel with the shooting unit that was just lighting, neon, streetlights. And again, this was I think it was the first digital movie. And so a lot of the lighting fell onto the shoulders of the decorating department with practicals.
One of the most interesting things about that movie was the amount of depth you had in that film.
Yeah.
Probably because it was digital, and then the lighting just kept going on and on and on. Yeah. It was pretty amazing.
It was
that
amazing.
Falls on you, Sandy, in a way.
Yes, it was amazing. I remember one night we were scouting. It was probably the 32nd floor overlooking Los Angeles. And I was standing with the lead man. We were looking out the window, and the gaffer came over and said, "How are you going to light that?" Oh, goody. It's
Yeah,
like
thank
living
you.
on all these rooftops. That was a good question.
Yeah.
But we did that. It was good. But you're right. Ever since, and you've talked about this too, it's like, yeah, now the decorating department and the production designers have to incorporate a lot more lighting into the sets.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we also, the last few movies that we've worked on have been film. A lot of the British directors like to use film.
Going forward.
Seven Psychopaths, Quentin likes to work on film. I lobbied with Charlotta, the DP, on Molly's Game to shoot on film, and we lost that battle to digital. But
I think that's a battle we all may lose now that COVID's here. I mean, now that we're all watching on smaller screens. I think
yeah, I don't
might
know.
be.
Yeah,
I don't know either.
Mm-hmm.
Hope not.
Can I ask you about sort of, and I sort of feel a little rushed because this is such an interesting conversation. We're sort of just scratching surface so far. But can we jump to what a lot of people online are kind of interested in, which is sort of the art department. What is your relationship, David, and then eventually yours, Sandy, with the art director? And I'll just lump in a couple of questions. And what is sort of your ideal setup for an art department?
Well, the supervising art director is kind of the key, crucial, important person. And particularly if, as movies are becoming more global, where we're brought to a city like Toronto for Molly's Game, my first person that I need to hire and meet would be the supervising art director. And I was very lucky in that maybe the best supervising art director, Brant Gordon, was available in Toronto. And then through that person, I like to let them tell me who the best construction person, the best paint person, paint team. And so I get a family of people, and that's how things are pulled off, because the prep time is diminishing, so things have to happen very quickly. So I was very lucky in our Molly's Game project with Brant. I was very lucky to connect with Isabelle Gay in Montreal, who's now a production designer on her own. Through her, I met the Brochu brothers, Alain Giguère, the great painter. Fantastic team comes through this one person that is connected with the community. And that's...
and Sandy, what's your relationship with the art director, and how do you kind of like to work with him?
It's so important when we're doing, of course, sets. You know, that is, the relationship has to be so, the communication has to be constant and hopefully open. And I think them in particular.
Right.
Well, I would also chime in and just say that I usually have to preface it and say, when I go to a community or a city, say that I'm usually going to give a larger voice to the decorating department with Sandy. So I sort of set the tone where you know, the key core team would be the art director, the decorator, and I actually like to have the art director and the decorator when we're picking these locations, particularly even when they're taking Aaron Sorkin around. I want to have Brant and I want Andy right with me, and we're hearing directly from the director so it's not being relayed from me to the art director and to the decorator. I'm a believer in firsthand information, but that's a really important person.
I would agree completely, and you were very lucky to get Brant. He is the best in town, basically. So I'm glad your Toronto experience was a good one. Can I sort of just jump into, you brought up locations. We had a question earlier. What do you want from a location scout? What are you looking for? And I'll expand that question a little bit. When you walk into a location, what draws you to that location? My background's architecture, so I'm always looking for that, basically, and then I can sort of see what I turn it into. So can we go back a little bit, just in terms of what that location manager or that location scout is bringing to you, how you'd like it presented, and then what are your thoughts on it when you actually go see the ones that you've picked?
Well, I like to again get a very strong location manager, as we had in Toronto. They should read the script. Sometimes they're on before I'm hired on. Sometimes a producer and a director will have a location person looking around a city to get ideas. Designer, which I don't think is great, but that's sometimes the case. But you want them to read the script and to say, this is my idea because I know the city. Same with if I'm in my hometown of Los Angeles, I have a few people that I have worked with frequently, and I like to work with them, and they read the script and they say, we brainstorm together. We have an office. I have an office in Los Angeles where our library is, and it's usually a production office being set up. So a lot of the early scouting usually happens out of our condo office, and that's where our library is. It's funny, again, I'm going to go back to saying that we're very analog. We do have a big book library. I'll find books like this Toronto Guide to Architecture, and you can see it's dog-eared and many tags on it. A lot of ideas come from the American Institute of Architects. Often puts out a guide for each city, and there are surprising good ideas that come from these architecture guides. We actually collect and have a pretty vast collection of Los Angeles and California guides, and we found locations. And I'm surprised actually some of the location managers that we work with don't refer to these. But
well, I got to say, locations is one of the hardest jobs on the movie.
Well, I think the two hardest jobs, location,
too, because what you want them to do is not only read the script, but ideally to have a feeling for it, to have a feeling for that house they're going to walk in and how they're going to move through the house or whatever, whether it's a house or a skyscraper or whatever, or not just, oh, here's this, this is convenient. You want someone to have a really good feel for it.
But I'll still like
Plus they have to deal with police and
regardless of the budget on the movie,
permits.
I'll still like to scout and try to do as many practical locations as possible, and then back out of what may become impossible to shoot in, and then build that as a set. And I'm going to go back to Molly's game, where we really were looking for a courtroom, things that you'd think, okay, we'll find a courtroom.
Well, the producer
it became impossible to shoot in the courtrooms in Toronto. So we end up building this massive courtroom set. But then the location manager has to get us into the hallways, a building that would then work on when you exit the set on a sound stage. Where do the actors end up walking to before they go into the set? So it's a very, very important position. And I like to, as I said, I like to have people that I've worked with before. I was very lucky to have some very good people in Toronto and Montreal. As a matter of fact, what got us to Montreal, I actually even have, this is the book that was put together by Nick Barker, who I don't know if is the Montreal Film Commissioner, but this was what was put together to sell Heist. And it was this massive book of fantastic Montreal locations that was just dazzling. And it got the movie to go to Montreal. And this was put together by the Film Commission. So these are things that are all part of my library.
Can I, and one of the things that you've been lauded for by guys I know who work with Brent, graphics people, is that you're one of those production designers who actually understands and likes and wants graphics. Please tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, there's no better way to do when there's no money. At least you're going to do signage and graphics because that'll sell a movie and help do a look. And I'm hugely big on graphics and really, and there's nothing worse than bad movie graphics. I'm coming from a family of graphic designers. As I said, my dad is a abstract expressionist painter. My dad's a hand letterer. He brought to the sons. My brother is a professional typography designer, James Wasco. So we're a family of of graphic and letter designers, and it's so important. Often I'll have sometimes there's two graphic designers that have to shoulder the amount of graphics that are then servicing costume department, prop department, picture vehicles, all of this. So it's really, really important. Right. And again, through Brant Gordon, I ended up getting some wonderful graphic designers, John.
Well, John Moran and David
Best. And David Best. Mm-hmm. And there were two people, not full-time all the time, but that was a very graphics-heavy movie, Molly's Game, particularly because we're doing the entire movie in Toronto, but the whole movie really takes place in New York City and in Los Angeles. Right. And then it's all poker, which is you know.
Right. And Sandy, let me ask you a little bit about that. Does graphics plays heavily into what you do? And it's not so much graphics, but it's artwork and generally just books that might be on a table, on a desk. And I want to lump this in with a larger question because we're really running out of time. Yeah. The larger question in a way is character's home. So if you've got an actor who's got a house, so let's say in La La Land, you had the house of the two lead characters. Do you like talking to them? And David, this applies to you as well, but we'll let Sandy go first. Do you like talking to the actors about what they would have in their house? Or would you just rather have the director's vision and your vision kind of give that to them?
Well, early on, I can't remember whether an actor approached me or I approached them, and this was really early on, and learned that was a no-no. So no, I think you have to wait till the director, or you go, yes, then I have to go ask the director for approval, because they may want, they may not want the character to go that direction. But we've also been really lucky once we've had that approval to incorporate some of the actors' things in the set. So in Jackie Brown, we had some of
Robert Forrester's
father's things in his office, in his bail bonds office, and
it helped him do the job. It helped the actor.
Right.
The things that
Carradine as well.
David Carradine on Kill Bill was very.
He wanted to use stuff.
Quentin was pretty open about it. We asked him, and he said, "Oh yeah, talk with David," because he said David wanted to have some of his furniture, have Sandy look at his furniture. So Sandy went and met with him, and then also both David Carradine and I are not so much Quentin. We're big car guys, and Michael Mann is a big car person also. So I talked at length with David Carradine about, even though he didn't drive anywhere, there was a car that was placed outside of L. Driver's trailer. And we were very careful about picking an interesting car, and we ended up picking an Italian Di Tommaso Mangusta, which is a great car. Car didn't drive anywhere, but it says so much about the character. Right. So when you have an opportunity to do a apartment or where that character lives, you can tell so much to the audience subliminally by just what you're surrounding the person with, and even the props. But I'll get back to the car thing. I think when you're putting an actor in a car, you're saying so much about that person. And Ryan Gosling also and I decided upon the car that he drove in La La Land, which was actually Ryan's idea. I wouldn't have put him in that one particular car, but.
And I think for graphics, the biggest collaboration I did on with that department was probably on Inglourious Basterds, because there had to be so many movie posters, whether they were on the streets of Paris or in the projection room, or maps on the wall. So that was a lot of work.
It was again
for that
a
department.
Herculean graphics job. All the marquee, all the
beautiful movie posters.
All of that was original.
Mm-hmm.
All of
and
that was
those
original.
Quentin really did sweat over those. So that was interesting, because that was one art department item that he did really care about.
Right. Okay. Can I lump all of this?
We did the movie within the movie, Nation's Pride, which had.
Right. Can I lump this in with another question that's come through from the people watching? The question is emotional connection to the design, and what elements of design are important for this to happen. Meaning, I suppose in a way we really try and underscore the visual narrative that the actors are putting on the screen, but we try and underscore the sort of emotion of the scene within what we do. In your bag of tricks, I suppose, is there something specific that you look for in this, or do you even pay any heed to this sort of thing?
I find, well, that's a really fun question to think about. When I'm thinking about it originally, I'm thinking about scenes where the set design and the tempo and the music and the lighting are all working. Mm-hmm. And that's just going to have to be one of those things that's collaborative. Right. It's something that it is emotional. It can be, color is so important for emotions in a way, and light and dark, of course, because they're sort of and then with production design and locations, having wide spaces or small spaces has an entirely different emotional.
Right. And I think, Sandy, one of the best examples of this in your work is essentially the opening of Inglourious Basterds, the farmhouse. So immaculately done. And all of those things that you just mentioned came together in that one particular set. Talk to us a little bit about how that set came about.
That was, it's funny because we've had conversations. Quentin, that was a built set, of course, because it's so characterful. But I know Quentin, even though he's doing Germany, and even though it is basically based on a true period, it is a Quentin world. And that house had to feel more like, it had to feel more like The Searchers. It had to be that lone house in the prairie that the Indians were going to come, and that's going to be the end of that. So I knew it had to be. I did research. I did my research on French farmhouses, and really and some of the things he didn't love, like he didn't love oilcloth on chimney mantles and things like that, which were sort of realistic. But you had to have that French clock in there, and you had to have but the simplicity was basically just like the early, John Wayne Westerns, where it's just that one room with a fireplace and a table for the family and the low rafters. And it gives this sort of prison. It's a prison, but it's a family unit too.
We were given 10 weeks. We were hired 10 weeks prior to principal photography for Inglourious Basterds, and then got sent to Berlin. And having worked on all of these other Quentin movies, we know that he likes to work in practical locations. He does like some sets on sound stages, but we thought we would scout this practical. And we did find the French farmhouse. We found a fantastic French farmhouse. I don't know what happened, but maybe 4 weeks into us scouting, burning up almost half of our prep, word came down that Quentin wanted everything built. So we then had to scramble, and we found on the Czechoslovakian border, we found distant buttes that were almost like Western John Ford buttes in the background. And we built the farmhouse there. Then we had to double build it on stage because we needed to then go a cross section of the farmhouse to then film below it for when they shot through the floor at Melanie hiding, the family hiding below the floor. So
yeah, pretty amazing. And David, how do you basically relay your thoughts in terms of the layering and especially the aging of something like that farmhouse? Where is it through reference? Do you sort of check in on it often? How do you kind of get to that?
Reference photos. We had many pictures. We had the benefit of having just scouted and found some really wonderful real farmhouses. So we were able to take that reference. And then having, again, a very good construction and paint department in Berlin, I rely on the talent and not so much micromanage them, let them do their thing. A lot of the construction in Berlin, where there would be faux box beams built, instead they would use a huge timber beam that would, and actually it became a slight problem in floating walls and the shootability of a set because huge timbers and real world things were used. They were harder to work as a machine for shooting.
We used a concept illustrator too for that scene with the farmhouse, so that whether Quentin wanted to look at it or not, we could all share it amongst ourselves.
That was the one thing that came up. Quentin does not like to use storyboards because it kind of locks him into, and so he also, and we found out on Inglourious Bastards that I had a fantastic concept illustrator that did these, this would be what it looks like. And he did not like that. And we distributed them to the department heads because that's our job to convey that information to costume and to everybody else. And that kind of riled Quentin a little bit, and he had us collect all of those images. And I think
it was the light. We, of course, for lighting and things. I think the specificity kind of bothered.
Maybe it became too specific. So.
Okay. Let me throw in a really great audience question. Talking about sort of a fuel for your creative juices. You've got lots of time these days to kind of fuel it. What do you do? What are your hobbies? And I don't want to use that term necessarily, but what is it kind of that you use to kind of educate yourself, keep yourself going?
It's interesting because our private pastime hobby is what we do when we location scout. We love the city of LA. We love going to different cities, and we love looking at architecture. So we take a million pictures. We use our reference guides for these different cities. We still, even though we've lived in Los Angeles for quite a few years, it's a vast city, and there's still things that we discover that we knew nothing about. And it's kind of a wonderful pastime that we share, and we love.
We're missing not being able to take road trips right now. But yeah, art, architecture, photography. One thing we should be doing more of while we have this downtime is actually practicing drawing and things like that, because it is something that's really fun to do.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing we end up doing that is not so, well, it's kind of a pastime, but it's also part of working on a movie, is that often we're hired onto a project pre it getting greenlit, and we end up spending a lot of time working on that movie. Not 10 hours a day, but we'll end up working on that to kind of figure that out. Mm-hmm. What that translates into then when the movie kicks in and becomes greenlit, you're ahead of the game with it. And that happened actually on La La Land. So that was...
LA is such a, I mean, it's no coincidence. You guys are LA residents. You love wandering around the city, and LA just looks so good on film. And, I'm thinking like even old movies like Double Indemnity or Altman's Long Goodbye, or, Heat, Mulholland Drive, those sort of films, To Live and Die in LA. Is there kind of and you've done a lot of movies in LA. I think I did do a count on how many. I think it was 9 or 10 that you've done in LA. Is that something?
13.
13. Okay. Is that on purpose, or is that just sort of coincidence?
Coincidence.
Yeah.
But you know, for the same reason that you like LA movies is the reason I think they're made here. It's a little bit of their it's not baggage, but it's the background of Los Angeles. It's Los Angeles has so many films. It has such film history here. And of course, France does too, and New York and elsewhere, Canada. But there's that language of noir and, well, starting with us, I mean, we were brought up, you know, you're brought up with Laurel and Hardy, you're brought up with W.C. Fields, and then it moves into your teens when you get involved with the noir movies, and you're just enamored with that. And then later the police procedurals, and there's that dialogue is in your mind and in your visual mind, storytelling, even before you get into it. And then once we're into it, you get to use all these things.
But the other thing that's kind of nice is that we almost look as though we're preserving the city, because when you the city even has changed since we captured it on Reservoir Dogs. From then, 10 years later, it's become different. It's such a organic city that is ever changing, that when you use it as a backdrop, we're preserving it for audiences to look at 50, 100 years from now. You can see sort of what, when you look at La La Land a few decades from now, this is sort of how the city looked, which was interesting. And we discover movies all the time. Like there's this obscure Anthony Mann movie, He Walked by Night, low budget, 1948. It's fantastic how it shows what LA looked like in 1948. Wonderful. And like you mentioned, our Double Indemnity, you know, you get to walk around Los Feliz, you get to go into grocery stores. And all. It's really wonderful. And in a way, we're preserving.
That's fantastic. So a couple more questions. And in terms of, I just want to follow up on the LA thing for a second, because some of the audience is asking a little bit of this. LA is basically the mecca of filmmaking. And in terms of sort of budding or nascent production designers, do they make the trip to LA? Is that where you, with your experience, in terms of connections and in terms of sort of where the project usually gets developed, is that something that you'd recommend to a new designer? Go to LA.
Over the last year, it's just terrible to say, but we've lately been telling kids to go, you kids listen to me, send them to Atlanta or places where we know they'll get it.
So much work.
There's so much work. Now, that's not the case right now, but that's what we did over the last couple of years, because Los Angeles, the business has moved out a little bit. It's starting to come back. They have a few little tax breaks, but also to go, I mean, you know, so it's difficult. Los Angeles, it's very good in maybe not filmmaking here, but in the music business and gaming and all the ancillary parts where different types of film are being used. And this is definitely a hub for that.
Well, the film business has become global, and we're finding more and more that we get brought to Vancouver, we get brought to Montreal, we get brought to Toronto. Our last movie that we were prepping that fell apart was in Albuquerque, where it's very, very busy. It's busier than Los Angeles. Now, it's really where, advice to people that are trying to break into the business, it's where your people connections will take you. You have to rely on getting these meetings. Now, all of that can be done virtual. It can be done just like we're talking right now. And then you have to end up being open-minded about going to wherever a project may be. Just like what Sandy said, there are these cities that are so busy that there aren't enough people to accommodate hiring a crew to do a movie, that if you end up moving there, you're going to get work. And that's, but my interviews happen in the city here in Los Angeles. So, but
Let me throw out another audience question, and I don't even know how this one gets answered, but it's an interesting question, and I'd like to just for us to think about it a bit. What are some of your favorite tricks of the trade that always get you out of a jam?
oh, it's funny. Yeah,
So, I don't know how you would answer that, but give it a try.
yeah, I'll just. There was a funny. We went and we watched a fantastic, because we watched a million musicals to figure out La La Land. And we watched a director's cut, Ken Russell, of The Boyfriend, an amazing, amazing musical.
Mhm.
And we heard then after, I believe it was Tony Walton, brilliant production designer. And he said that his trick that he learned from working with Ken Russell, because Ken Russell, I would liken his description to like Wes Anderson or Damien Chazelle, where they're with ideas. Ideas are constantly happening. He said he carried with him a big roll of heavy-duty aluminum foil, which then he can fashion anything out of. If he needed a chair,
It was great.
like he had this roll of aluminum foil.
Arches.
And I thought that was a great idea. So I've been carrying with me a big roll of black wrap,
For
like
long.
this heavy-duty aluminum foil that I use for, and you can make like a little wall or whatever. That's just a silly,
I don't think
but
you
it's
used
a true story from
And I
Tony
think
Wall.
sometimes when I'm doing things, I'll by maybe something that's wrote like a schoolroom. Your first thing in mind is sort of pedestrian, and then my trick is okay. Let's go completely opposite. Let's try and just turn everything around and do something totally different, and you'll find some medium that's happy.
Right, nice. This is going to turn into a bit of a talk show like Merv Griffin. We have a guest star,
Oh, good.
a surprise guest who's been watching us. He met you during the Oscar run-up, and when he was also nominated in the production design category, and he's been nominated twice for an Academy Award, once for the Young Victoria, and then again for Arrival. And he's done crazy good movies like Crazy, Enemy, Sicario, Prisoners, and recently he did Vice and Dune. And
Yeah.
I'm sure you know by now who that is. So I don't know how we can. Oh, here we go.
Trees.
Yes.
We're almost there. The Zoom thing takes a minute or two to get in. So
Great.
however
That's
we
great.
can.
Thank you.
While we're doing that, maybe can I ask you one last question, sort of an audience thing? Production designers are their own worst critics. What makes you wince when you see your own movie up there? What is something that just drives you nuts?
Boy.
Oh, it's usually because there was something that had to be really cheap, and I just thought something would suffice, and it just, when you see it on a big screen, it doesn't. Hello.
Yes.
Hey, how are you guys?
How are you?
Hi, Arv. Nice meeting you, Arv. Cool.
Pleasure meeting you, Patrice.
Yeah.
See you.
Well, thank you for feeding my family, helping feeding my family to Sandy and David, because this is what we've been.
Oh, goody.
Oh,
Oh,
that's
goody.
great.
So
That's
we
great.
take this confinement into learning more about vegan eating, and
That's
thank you.
great.
And thank you for being so fantastic tonight and so generous.
Oh, this has been, we look forward to seeing all the next shows. This has been great. We watched
Well, we're anxious to see Dune. That's going to be the next.
Me too. Me too. Man.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like,
So, Patrice, you're pretty much finished. You must be in post-production by now, Dune.
yeah, it is. It is. It is.
Okay. And how long ago did you finish it?
I finished it. We finished a camera. Mid-August last year.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And then
And you were in Hungary, I think, shooting it.
we were in Hungary, we were in Norway, and we were in Abu Dhabi and Jordan.
Oh, fantastic. I've worked in Hungary and Jordan, and I'm
Great,
sure
huh?
we shared the same crew. So in next talk we might have something to talk about in common.
No, absolutely. We need to share, like, sharing crews all over the world. There's great crews, and I think it's all about mixing.
yes.
Yeah.
I think Hans is going to come on in a second. I just wanted to take this time. First of all, thank you, Patrice, for joining us. And
I don't want to take too much of your time because I want to keep listening to Sandy and David, because I'm a huge, as you know, guys, I'm a huge fan of you guys, and
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Mutual.
I almost worked with them on Heist in Montreal. Isabelle Gay had wanted me to join join the crew because they were looking for art directors, and
But it's terrific. One of the things that kind of we want to say thank you to David and Sandy for is just sort of the amount of knowledge that they imparted to the Toronto crew here. I do hear that a lot from everybody who worked on Molly's Game, for example.
Wow.
That you guys are amazing in terms of sharing your wealth of knowledge, and you're just lovely people to work with. So that's
welcome.
It's a collaboration. We all collaborate. And actually, just in hearing about Dune, that gets it to be an uber collaboration when you get that global.
Yeah.
That's
great to hear about.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
That's fantastic. Well, we're going to end it there, basically. One moment, please. Things are flying in. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Hans, for allowing us to do this. And I want to thank the audience, all the people that joined in on this. It's been terrific. It's been my pleasure to kind of speak to you guys and relay audience questions to you. Here's Hans.
Thanks, Ar.
Thank you. And happy birthday, Martine.
oh, yes, Martine. We're doing it. It's Martine. Yes, it's Martine.
Okay.
Well, that was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much, Sandy and Patrice for joining us. Thank you so very much.
I hope this was okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Okay.
We'll see you next week.
Okay.
To everybody that's watching, tune in next week for a double bill. We had originally planned on hosting a screening of Jeff Barnaby's new film, Blood Quantum, at the TIFF Bell Lightbox here in Toronto, but that was derailed, like so many things, by the pandemic. Blood Quantum, Jeff Barnaby's second film, and equally as brilliant as his first, No Rhymes for Young Ghouls, will be available online as of midnight Monday. And we have Jeff and Jesse Wente, director of Canada's Indigenous Screen Office, here on Wednesday night to talk about it. It's going to be an incredible conversation. Then in our usual spot, next Thursday night, we have Oscar-nominated director of The Cave and Last Man in Aleppo, Firas Fayyad, with award-winning DGC doc director Christy Garland. Also an incredible conversation. So wait for the invitations and the links. It continues to be a great ride. And we hope it's providing some relief, entertainment, and inspiration in these very challenging times. David, Sandy, Arv, Patrice, thank you so much again.
Okay.
Can I just, before we sign off, everybody, I would like from David and Sandy and Patrice, just one or two movies that you would like people who are watching you to watch. Give us a couple of movies that we can throw out there on people, new or old.
Oh
no, I put everybody on.
You did.
Anthony Mann, He Walked by Night.
Well, you said the Walk by Night. Oh, there's so many.
That's a great one.
That might be hard to get.
No,
I don't think so. I think we get that fairly easily. Patrice, anything that you'd like us to take a look at?
Holy crap.
Holy. How about?
That's after a couple of these, my friend.
I know. I'm thinking, well, what did I just see that was so good?
Right. Well, listen, I've been watching a bunch of horrors lately, so I'll throw out a couple. I'll throw out The Platform and Disco and maybe Cold Case Hammer Skull, if people want to check those.
Very cool.
We can watch many black and white noirs.
Yes. Watch Double Indemnity. That's a great one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
On Monday night, check out Blood Quantum. It is like nothing else
great.
you see.
Yeah.
Blood is great.
It is very new, very different, and we'll be talking to Jeff and Jesse. So check that out as well. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, guys. It's a pleasure.
Take care. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
That's fantastic.